interviewing Peter Holloway in his home. Peter,
incidentally, my name's not really Peter. I've never been known as anything else. It's Charles Turley.
What shall we call you during this interview?
Peter. But just for the record, we had trouble with the bank yesterday on that one.
Peter, could you tell us where you were around about June, July in 1941?
June, July 1941. I was working in Wonthaggi in the bank, waiting for my call up for national service. I'd signed my national service papers and I was on relieving staff of the bank, and I was relieving a guy down in Wonthaggi who was doing his national service. And then as soon as he'd finished his 90 days, I was to go in for mine.
And what were you aiming to do in the war effort?
As little as possible. I'd tried to join the Air Force earlier on, and they wouldn't accept me because I had ingrowing toenails. And then later on I tried to join the AIF, and the bank wouldn't release me for some reason I've never quite comprehended. The bank was declared a protected occupation, and so under manpower controls, anyone who was in a protected occupation could not join up unless they walked away and lied about it and left the job. But the job was, I was a child of the Depression. You didn't walk away from jobs in those days. But I looked forward to my national service because at least I was going to get a little bit of training. And so it was in August, I think it was, I eventually got my call up and went to Mount Martha to the 59th Battalion of the 15th Brigade.
And how did you get into the 39th?
Well, we moved from there up to near Seymour to Rokeby, and routine order came out one day that a new battalion was being formed, which would be a little bit different to any other militia battalion, inasmuch that the papers which those members who joined it signed, they could be sent anywhere to defend Australia. And if there weren't enough volunteers to make up this battalion, the quota from the 59th Battalion, well, then the commanding officer would nominate people who would go, whether they wanted to go or not. So I suddenly had a brainwave. This is how I could defeat the bank. And so I got myself paraded to the commanding officer, or first of all to my OC, and then he arranged for me to see the commanding officer. And he said, we'll soon fix that up. I told him what my plan was, that I would go with this unit, and then as soon as I was in full-time service, I'd join the AIF, and he concurred with that. And so that's how I got into the 39th and found myself on a train down to the Caulfield Racecourse like everybody else did, and then the next day up to Darley.
Now this tells us that you had a unique position in the brigade.
Well, I no matter whether in the brigade, but certainly as far as the battalion was concerned, because once I got to Darley, the first thing I did was, according to my own plan, was I had no loyalty to the 39th Battalion at that stage. I had great loyalty subsequently. But I got hold of some papers to enlist in the RAF and signed them and handed them in. And the reply came back that no transfers out of the 39th Battalion would be considered. I thought, oh well, it was a good try, and that was it. I believed that my enlistment in the RAF had been refused. I discovered much later on that, in fact, I had been enlisted in the RAF, and almost the whole time I served in the 39th Battalion, I was in fact a member of the AIF. And it made a significant difference at the time of my discharge, because members of the AIF got benefits which militia members at that stage didn't get. And so I got more deferred pay, I got more subsistence, I got a bigger war gratuity. And I had no idea of any of those things when I signed the papers. And when the transfer was refused, I accepted it and stayed with the 39th, and of course developed a great loyalty to it.
When you were at Darley, what sort of work was done to form the battalion into a group of people working together?
Sadly, not much. The companies each developed a real cohesion. Well, as far as we did in E Company, E Machine Gun Company, we certainly developed a real cohesion. But the view that I've developed over the years, that the loyalties were to companies rather than to the battalion. And to some degree in headquarters company, to the platoons, if they were Pioneer Platoon or SIGS Platoon or Mortar Platoon, they had the loyalty to their specialist group. But there wasn't a great deal done to say, we are the 39th, which we're very proud to say now. But I never found that significant at the time. I'm saying that with the benefit of hindsight. There wasn't a great deal done. We marched through the city streets in a war loan rally. I think that did something to create a sense of core, that here we were, a unit, marching through the streets like those blokes from the RAF. We saw ourselves, there was a constant battle of the chocos and the real soldiers, putting real in inverted commas. But here we were doing the same sort of thing as they were. And so that gave us a sense of being, but at an official level, not much was done to create a spirit towards the 39th.
And on the eve of departure, on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, what was the feeling in the battalion and how did you feel?
We didn't believe we were going. It was just another exercise. Mm-hmm. We guessed we'd go sometime, somewhere, but we thought we might go to Darwin, we thought we might even go to Singapore. But at Christmas, we didn't really believe, or at least I didn't, and I didn't find anybody else, really believe we were going anywhere until we got on the train. And when we arrived at the Bacchusmar station and there was a train, yeah, this was fair dinkum, but most of us thought it was just another exercise.
And what was that train trip like?
A train trip? I think, I remember a discussion we had somewhere up round about Wodonga. We were sitting in the carriage and it suddenly dawned on us that some of us may not be coming back. And that was quite prophetic, really. And we made it a pact, just a little group of us there. We made a pact that if any of us were with any of the others, when we got the lot, we would write to the family. And I think that was the first realisation. It was just a game, really, up to then. No, not a game, but it wasn't for real. But on the train, I think, was our first realisation. Then, of course, I remember arriving at Albury and this incredible business of having to move from one side of the platform to the other to another train. I remember that. We must have slept on the train. I have no recollection of it. I remember sleeping on trains a lot later on in the war. But we must have slept somehow. We certainly didn't have sleeping carriages. And then we arrived in Sydney down to Woolloomooloo. And here was this huge four-funnelled ship And then out in the middle of the harbour, this great behemoth, the Queen Elizabeth, QE1. Lord, where are we going? You know, we thought she was part of the convoy too. Definitely, we're going to Malaya. We're going to Singapore. We still hadn't been told where we were going. The average soldier didn't know until we were well at sea. Some of the officers might have known. And as I was the company clerk, now I was probably in as good a position as any of the other ranks to hear officers talking. And I certainly never heard our OC or our 2IC or anyone else among the officers discussing the fact we were going to New Guinea. So I doubt very much if they knew either. We were well out at sea. I can remember the Aquitania was a big ship. She was, I think, 65,000 tonnes, something like that, a big ship for a day, four-funnelled, sister ship to the Lusitania and the Mauritania and all those. And the Titania, as she was originally going to be called, and then they changed it to Titanic, but she was to be called Titania. But I remember as we were going out through Sydney Heads, walking down one of the passageways and seeing the ship twist. And you could actually see the passageway twisting as the ship rolled. And that's an impression that stuck in my mind. We were all made to strip. We were barely outside Sydney Heads when we were made to strip for a physical inspection and made to have a shower, and we were given straw palliasses and bunked down. But before we left Woolloomooloo, of course, we saw the Army's ultimate disgrace, and I describe it as that, very sincerely. These poor buggers of kids who some only 2 days before, on Christmas Eve, had received their call-up papers, were given a uniform and were put in the Aquitania. And they'd never seen a rifle. They didn't know how to put a uniform on even, let alone handle a rifle. And here they were protestingly being bulldozed onto the Aquitania. And many of the books we've read and heard about since, the 53rd Battalion doesn't figure as one of the famous battalions of the Army. And that wasn't the kids' fault. It was Army Command. And it was a disgrace, the things that were done to those kids. And of course they were never fighting men. They never would be fighting. And some of them did. Some of them did a good job. But right up at the top, it was an utter disgrace. Men were pitchforked into that situation. And we saw that, what on earth have we got here with our... At least we knew where we were going. We knew when we were all volunteers. Our commanding officer had called us onto a general parade at Darley and said, I hear some of you are here against your will. You have my word, if any of you ask to be transferred back to your unit, that will be done. Not one of you has to go unless you want to, and not one person that I'm aware of asked for a transfer back. So that meant that every man in the 39th Battalion was a volunteer. Those who had been detailed were given the chance to back off. And I think I'm right in saying that no one accepted it. If there were any, they were very, very few.
And when you saw the horizon of New Guinea, and I suspect the smoke as you were coming towards it, what is your feeling about coming towards the shore of another country?
A bit overwhelmed at the height of the mountains. You know, someone who's lived in Australia all their life, if they've ever seen Australia's highest mountains, they've only seen 5,000 feet. And most of us had never seen Kosciuszko or Mount Bartle Frere, so it was 2,000 or 3,000 feet most of us had seen. And here are these great little realising what a significant part they're going to play in our lives later on. Here were these huge mountains apparently rising up out of the sea. Because we had another excitement on the voyage. I sank a submarine. We had a would-be submarine attack, and well, it was an interesting story for that. Being machine gunners, we were put up on the boat deck, and we didn't have to sleep down in the hulls like all the others did. And the Aquitania was built for the Atlantic crossing. She wasn't built for sailing in the tropics, and there was no air conditioning. So it was a bit of a hellhole below decks. But the machine gun company, we were put up to man machine guns on the boat deck to protect us against any marauding aircraft. And so we took our palliasses up on the boat deck, and we were exempt from all boat drills. And I think to keep people occupied, boat drills were called with a monotonous regularity. But we ignored them. But this particular night, half of the machine gunners had gone down to the dining room to have their evening meal, and the claxons went round the ship for a boat drill, or not a bloody boat drill, but we'd ignored it. Until we'd finished our meal, started to make our way up, and we found all the bulkhead doors closed and everything. We eventually got up to find that the convoy had been dispersed. The old Aquitania, which had been known as the Greyhound of the Atlantic, had opened up to full speed ahead and left the convoy, and we're told that the naval ships did in fact have a successful effort against an enemy submarine, and they believed that they had sunk it. So that was a bit of excitement we had in the voyage, and I think that brought home to us very much that we were in a war zone. We were beginning to realise. And I think all these things helped the spirit of the 39th. We were volunteers. We knew we were going to war. We knew not what kind of a war. And here was the reality. There were others there who didn't have that. They didn't develop the spirit the 39th developed. But coming into New Guinea, we sailed into Moresby Harbour, and we hadn't had a beer, not since we'd left Darley. And I remember as we were standing waiting, because Aquitania couldn't go into the wharf, and we were taken off in lighters or on the Achilles. Some of them went off in the Achilles, which was one of the escort destroyers, the smaller warships. And we stood hour after hour in passageways waiting for our turn to go off. And I remember seeing one of the ship's officers coming along with a huge jug of beer. And I said to him, "Are you an engineer?" "Yes." "By Jove, how did you know I was an engineer?" "Why do you ask?" I said, "Well, I was wondering if you could engineer us some beer."
And did he?
And he threw his head back and roared laughing and gave us a jug of beer and went away and got himself another one. No glasses, we just drank it out of the jug. It didn't last very long.
Well, two heavy things about Port Moresby. One, we know that times were tough with poor preparation, but what was it like when for the very first time you came under enemy attack? How did you feel?
Well, that's a good question. I could tell you all about the lack of preparedness of sleeping in fly-blown blankets and all that sort of thing, of going to the dysentery compound. We had one tap for 1.5-inch tap for 1,000 men. We had no latrines, no toilets, no cooking facilities. The ship had been laden in a remarkable way. The tents and ammunition and guns and everything were right in the bottom, and unnecessary things were being packed on top. And it was a routine order came out first of all, and I think this has got to be said, advising the troops to behave like cats, not dogs. And you might wonder what that meant. But then there was a little note under it. Cats bury their excreta, dogs leave it on the top.
Okay.
And that was a big problem. Yeah. And within a very short time, dysentery was rife. We had the wrong clothes. We had the wrong leg wear. And the grass seeds got into our skin and they pierced the skin and ulcers grew. Later, much later, too late, they provided us with gaiters and putties, but we didn't have those things. Even if we'd had the things that they wrapped around their legs in the First World War, we'd have been better off. But they did provide us with canvas gaiters ultimately. I've still got mine up in the shed. And that protected us. But these grass seeds went into the skin and they infected. And there was no hospital facilities, not enough hospital facilities. And so an incredible number of us developed ulcers. Anti-malarial precautions were primitive, to say the least. And then we'd been there about a month. The physical conditions had improved a bit by then. It must have been round about the beginning of February we had the first air raid. And there was a bit of a puzzle about Bill Merritt, how he came to be in the militia battalion, because he'd been in the AIF. Major Merritt he became later, he was a captain at that stage. And I had a very strong attachment to Bill, so I'm not being critical of him in what I'm saying. He'd trained as a commando down at Wilson's Promontory. And somehow he retained his commission, but he was out of the AIF and into the militia. And I've never really had a satisfactory explanation of that. But because he had been in the AIF, he was a little bit of a god. He knew everything. And he was responsible in some measure for making us all a bit scared of air raids. You mustn't stand out in the open. You mustn't look up at them. So help me goodness, we know now. I've flown a lot, and you can't see a face anyhow if somebody's looking up. But he would say they can see your face if you look up and they'll drop their bombs on you. Well, to use a term which is not very elegant for a priest, we were shit scared, most of us. And anyone who tells me that they went through the war without being scared is a liar or an idiot. Of course we were all scared. And I've often said that bravery is not being not scared. Bravery is being scared and going on. And so when those first bombs fell, we were quite sure that they had our name on them, most of us. As a matter of fact, I saw a bomb with my number on it. We were camped on the 7 Mile drome, and of course the Air Force had their bombs stacked nearby, and right outside my tent there was a stack, or there must have been 50 to 100 bombs in the stack, in little wooden crate things, and every one of them had a serial number on it. And would you believe that one of them had a serial number that was identical with my regimental number? So I used to hold that thing on and don't you go off. It never did. And I often laughed that it actually did have my regimental number on it. That probably meant that I was going to go through the war more or less safe. But we came to get quite skillful about the bombing. We would watch them. We didn't take any chances when the Zeros came across and strafed our area, as they did with monotonous regularity. We went to ground. We got down to the slit trenches or wherever we could get for protection. But we got to the stage with the bombers where we'd watch them, and we'd watch the bombs tip over as they came out of the bomb bays, and we could usually tell fairly accurately where they were going to land. And I don't know whether it was true or not, but we were always told if you could hear the bomb, it wasn't going to hit you. But I never heard anyone who got hit by a bomb tell us whether that was true or not. But we were always told if you can hear it, it's not going to hit you. Well, we heard a lot of bombs, none of them hit us. And you lead a charmed life. One night during a night raid, I'm waffling on, aren't I?
No.
One night during a night raid, because things had improved at this stage and we had mosquito nets. And I'd actually made myself quite an acceptable bunk. And the air raid sirens went off, and the the drone of the Japanese bombers coming over. And the searchlights picked them up. And we all got out of bed to watch this display. Well, most of us slept as God created us because it was coolest. And I still don't know why I did it, but on this particular night I picked up my tin hat and put it on. So I said, Jack, now I'm not naked, I've got my hat on. Well, just as well I did. Because it wasn't very long before I thought somebody had hit me on the head with a sledgehammer. A bit of the ack flak came down and hit my tin hat. Made a heck of a dint in the tin hat and gave me a headache. But it saved my life. And I guess every one of us can tell stories similar to that. The story at Sanananda where a sniper was taking pot shots at them, this is much later again, taking pot shot at and broke the windscreen of the Jeep I was in, put holes in the seat I was sitting on. From hole. So most of us who came through can tell lots of stories like that, I'm sure. But not all of us were so fortunate.
While you were in Moresby, you got ulcers.
Tropical ulcers, yes, on my legs.
What was the effect of that on your story?
Well, nobody seemed to know how to treat them, and because I've never seen anything like them down here. They just got bigger and bigger and bigger, and on both legs, the ulceration on the shins reached from virtually just below my knees to just above my ankles, on both legs. And we used to just bandage them up, there wasn't much to put on them. Occasionally, Mum would send me a tin of Zambuck from home. Remember Zambuck? You can still get it. I saw it in the shop recently. It was a cure-all for everything. Don't know that it cured goiters or pregnancies, but about everything else. And but they just got to the stage where I could barely walk.
But that didn't mean you didn't do duty.
Oh no, of course it didn't. You did everything. And the regimental medical officer said to me, I think we're going to have to send you back to Australia, to Townsville, to hospital, to get treatment. You'll come back here when you're better. So he said, but I'll sign the papers. He said, then we'll have to get another doctor to sign them as well. And then first available transport, be it by air or ship, you'll go back to Townsville, and when you're recovered, you'll be sent back. That was all a bit iffy in light of later events, but okay. And so the McDewey had pulled into, the McDewey was a Burnstilp trading vessel that used to come in regularly. The McDewey had pulled into Moresby Harbour, and of course these labourers that they'd brought up from Australia, they called them an army, but we were really wharf labourers, were sent in to unload the McDewey. And I was on the truck to go in with the rest of the party, and Gona, a motorcycle rider, came with a message that I was to report to the main dressing station at Buna, just opposite where the war cemetery is now, and for my second part of my medical board. And so I was taken off the truck and somebody else was put on, and off they went to unload the McDewey. Well, I've always understood, although I'm not certain of it, that the man who took my place was one of the unfortunates, was down in the hold when the bomb went down the funnel and exploded inside the McDewey and killed some of our people. Now, I can't verify that, but obviously that one didn't have my number on it either. And I went out to Bumana dressing station, and the old doc there, who God knows how he got into the army, he was so old, but mind you, the 39th Battalion had 2 men with 1 arm each. They came from Australia with 1 arm. How they passed a medical exam, I don't know. We had 1 man with 1 eye, and another one who couldn't read at all because his eyesight was so bad he used to have to get someone to tell him.
And you had ingrown toenails.
I had ingrown toenails and they wouldn't take me in the Air Force. But that was the way it was. This old doc said, I think I can cure them, but if I do, you won't get back to Townsville. Well, they were talking about the possibility of both legs having to be amputated because the ulcers got down onto the bone. I said, I'm much more interested in getting my legs better than going back to Townsville. But actually, they've never got better. I still have problems with those same ulcers, but they're very minor now. The treatment he used, and Merrin as a nurse will be interested in this, is I don't want to even use any of these newfangled drugs, I'm just going to use hot foments. And that's what he did, and miraculously they started to clear up.
What did he use as a foment?
Just rags. Just hot rags. That's all he had. Silly, we were in New Guinea, this is the army. And we're at war, don't you know? So that was the stock saying, there's a war on, you know. If you couldn't get something, you know there's a war on. And so they were almost cleared up. And he sent me up to, Coral Sea was on, and they wanted to evacuate the hospital, or the dressing station. It wasn't really a hospital. They sent me up to the convalescent depot at Koitaki. The young doctor there thought sulfanilamide would work better than hot foments. And so he started sprinkling them with sulfanilamide. I now have an allergy to all sulphur drugs and they can't use them. But he sent me back to the unit with a bottle of sulfanilamide powder, which I was to sprinkle on them every day. And this was at the time that E Company was setting off up the track. Bill Merritt and the boys. And so off we set. Well, I don't really know where it was, but I decided at that stage that Holloway was a liability. That I was having difficulty walking, I was having to be helped to walk. If it was like that then, and they knew enough about what lay ahead at that stage. Not much about what lay ahead, but I knew a bit about it. If it was like that going up, what was it going to be like when they got there? And some protesting from me, but I must confess not a lot. But I did protest a bit about being sent back. I was sent back. And back to the main dressing station at Bumana. back to hot foaments again, and eventually back up to Koitaki Convalescent Depot with strict instructions that no sulfonylamide was to be used. And of course, you do duties just the same. Although you're on the sick list, I was corporal of the guard. And I got a message that the OC of the convalescent depot, who had been our company OC, Major John Barrow, wanted me to report to the orderly room. I thought, oh, what have I done wrong? Or what's one of my guard done wrong? I thought one of them had been found asleep or something. And so over I went and reported and sprang to attention and saluted him. And he said, sit down, Peter. Well, as soon as he said that, I knew I wasn't in any trouble. He said to me, do you trust me? That's a funny thing for an officer to ask you. He was a great man. He was a real father figure to us. Farmer Barrow, they called him. He used to come out on parade ground wearing gumboots. Had a wonderful old fella, and I actually, back in civvy life, I ministered to him and counselled him, and he couldn't adapt back to civilian life, and he kept his service revolver, and he put it to its wrong use in the end. And I presided at his funeral, and that's another story. But he said, good, he said, you're not going back to the 39th? Well, I did protest about that, because whilst earlier I'd had no loyalties, by this time I had a lot of loyalties to it, as we all did. He said you trusted me, don't argue. You're going back to brigade headquarters. What he knew and what I didn't know was that the machine gun company was being taken away from the infantry battalion. We were being put on the same war footing as the AIF units, which only had 4 infantry companies and no machine gun company. And a machine gun regiment was being formed, which would be quite separate. And so what old John was doing is anyone he could, he was getting them transferred to other companies or somewhere within the fighting unit of the brigade. And I was transferred to brigade headquarters as senior supply clerk for the brigade, working with an officer with an unbelievable name, Diddums. It was inevitable that he was known as Daddy Diddums. Good bloke. From Queensland. And I found myself at brigade headquarters. An interesting little story there too, is we didn't have a brigade commander at that stage. He'd gone for some reason or other. When I went there, I'm not sure who the brigade commander was, but the position was vacant. And just near my tent, which was really only a tent fly and bunks underneath it, there was a shower. Cold shower, of course, no hot water, with a bit of hessian round it. And nobody seemed to use it, so I went down every morning and had a nice shower near my tent. And on this particular morning, another guy came and shared it with me. And they were talking as a matter of time. Oh, I said, I believe the new brigadier comes today. And he said, yes. And I wonder what it'll be like. Oh, this fella said, oh, I think he might be all right. And off I went and got dressed and had breakfast and went up to the office where I was working, and Bill Town, who was the staff captain of brigade, I'd worked with Bill in civvy, so I knew Bill quite well and become significant later on. He brings a new brigade commander round. Oh, and this is Corporal Holloway, the senior supply clerk. He said, yes, Corporal, we've already met, haven't we? In the raw.
And from there you went to Popondessa?
Well, eventually we did. We flew across, the whole brigade moved across to the north side after Kokoda had been retaken. We flew across to Popondetta in the old DC-3s. I'd had a spell, because technically when I'm going to backtrack a little bit there, because I'd had other experiences with DC-3s before we flew across. And it's relevant, and you wouldn't know the new priming for me to tell you about this. Technically, when I went to 60th headquarters, I was transferred to an Army Service Corps company, the Army's providores. And the officer in charge of the 15th Supply Personnel Company was Tom Grigg, who had been a 39th Battalion officer, and one of his men had got into trouble, and Tom sort of defended him and got into disgrace himself, unfairly, but by the hierarchy of the day, he was not fit to serve in an infantry battalion and was sent out to do menial work in a supply company. Grossly unfair. I had an interesting experience because I could touch type in those days, and I was sent to the court-martial of this particular soldier who was in trouble that Tom had defended, and took the evidence down, typed it straight onto the typewriter. Don't ask me to do it now. And that was beside the point. But, of course, they developed the idea of biscuit bombing, dropping stuff up at Myola and other places. And so part of my job was to wrap these various goods up in blankets or bags or what have you, and then we'd load them onto DC-3s, because the Air Force didn't have anyone silly enough to hang on to the inside of an aircraft without any seats in it, loaded with groceries and ammunition and what have you, and no door on the aircraft, and push the stuff out to the troops underneath. And so I had some experience being on the sending end of the biscuit bombing, both of packing the stuff, and I did a couple of stints of pushing the stuff out. I never fell out. And if we did, we were gone, because there were no parachutes. So
when you got to Popondetta, did you know much about what to expect at the beachheads?
we had a bit of an idea, but you see, our boys had been up and down the Kokoda Track several times by that time, and so the stories had come back. I must say that those, and I'd seen a bit of the track. Of course, Popondetta wasn't like that at all. It was virtually, it wasn't floodplain, but it was comparative to floodplains. It was flat country. We could hear the shooting going on. We knew there was a war on. There was no doubt about that. We knew there was a war on. And we got off the aircraft at Popondetta and we marched down to Soputa. And we set up our bases and what have you at Soputa. And the boys scattered. The infantry went to Sanananda or Gona or Gona, which is its proper name, but we never called it Gona. But the natives call it Gona. Yes, that's the way it's pronounced by them. I had become rather fluent in Motu at this stage. I was never much good at Pidgin, but Motu was the language of the porters. And of course, because we were handling supplies, we were dealing with the porters as well, who carried supplies in and the wounded out. And so, because of this, we had a bit of an idea of what was ahead of us. But I think it would be fair to say that the war at Gona and Sanananda, Soputa, was different to the war in the hills. There was jungle, and you couldn't see the enemy. You never saw them, very seldom. Well, I think I did see one once, among our lines. And when I went back to take a second look at it, he was gone. But I'm reasonably sure that a Jap had infiltrated through. Tell you an interesting story about Christmas. fresh meat was non-existent. It was all tinned meat or dried meat. You ever eaten dehydrated meat? I won't say anything. But we decided we were going to have roast pork for Christmas dinner. Some of the boys got 3 pieces of barley sugar for Christmas dinner that day, and that's recorded, I think, in Peter Brune's book. One of the books it's mentioned, but that's true. But where we were, we got one of our native boys and gave him a 303 rifle and 3 rounds of ammunition. He said, go and shoot a pig and bring the empty shells back. Well, he brought a pig back for us, and 2 empty shells and 1 live one. And we gave him a kick in the backside for missing the first time. But next day we smelt the smell of roast pork coming from their camp as well. But one of them, many of them spoke quite good English, asked us what we were doing for vegetables with the roast pig. Or only what we've got on. They're not much good, Talbot. So next thing we knew, he arrived back with a huge bag of vegetables. He'd infiltrated through the Japanese lines down to one of the village because they didn't know whether they were our boys or their boys, and we didn't know either. And I'm quite sure I passed this going, after I passed him, that's a Jap. And when I went back, there was no sign of him. But I'm fairly sure that one of them had infiltrated through to have a look at us. One of the interesting things that happened to us, we had a lovely Christmas dinner, even though some of the boys only had 3 bits of barley sugar. But a few days later, I had one of my many, many visits to hospital. I think it was malaria. Oh, it was an interesting story about that visit to the hospital too. We had one of the 2-year wonder doctors came up. You know what a 2-year wonder doctor is? Well, they shortened their period of training. They didn't do midwifery or anything like that. Mind you, they found out they needed it sometimes. Some of the nurses seemed to need midwives. And that's one of the realities of war. But we called them 2-year wonders because they had a short course. They finished, only did the essentials to come to war and finished the rest afterwards. This young fellow, wet behind the ears, here am I, half dead with malaria. And he says to me, where were you when the mosquito bit you? And he couldn't understand why I got horse laughed all over the dressing station. Where were you when the mosquito? They sounded like a great pipe organ at night time. That's one of my very early recollections of arriving in Moresby. I could hear this organ playing, deep notes on an organ. It was mosquitoes.
Moving from organs and mosquitoes, you became a priest of the Anglican Church. Did the New Guinea experience lead you in that direction?
No. I was supposed to resign from the bank in 1941 and go into theological college. The decision had been made long before that. I was actually studying Greek at that time. But I told the bishop I thought there was a job to be done. And he, as an ex-chaplain from the First World War, agreed with me. And so I interrupted my training, and I was still in the bank, but I was studying part-time. Interrupted my training and went into the army, and the vicissitudes of which you know. One thing that did influence me very greatly, not in my decision to study for and become a priest, but in the way I functioned and still do function as a priest, and that was Father Noviel. He would be, yes, I think he'd be right, he'd be the greatest Christian I've ever met.
Now, I believe that you were associated with his funeral?
I was indeed. I had a long association with him during the war. He turned up in all sorts of odd places to bury people. There's a story, I'm just reading the latest book, Peter Fitzsimmons' book, and an episode there I'd never heard about before, but I don't doubt it's true, where he walked out between the Japs and our boys to bury somebody and both sides stopped firing while he did it. Shovel over his shoulder and buried this lad. And then when he walked away, the firing started again.
Now, this unity also appears when you were at the funeral.
Yes. And I was invited by his superior to take part in his Requiem Mass. And that was one of the greatest honours that's ever been conferred on me. And then subsequently, when the whole plane load of us went up to his funeral. There were more of us then than there are now, of course. And then subsequently had a memorial service down here at the monastery in Melbourne, Sacred Heart Monastery in Melbourne. And I was the preacher and was again invited to take part in the Requiem Mass. And that was in a much less liberal era than we live in today.
Can you tell us what it means by the word to concelebrate and why that was so special?
To concelebrate is to join in the actual act of consecration of the bread and the wine as the holy elements of the communion. There is always a celebrant. You can't have a Mass or a Eucharist without a celebrant. But more than one can take part. And the tradition in religious communities, such as Nobby belonged to, and it began there, was that they would gather around the altar and say the words of thanksgiving, the great thanksgiving together, and consecrate the bread and the wine together. That's celebration. It's now more widespread than just in religious communities, but that's where it began. And as an outsider, I was invited to take part. And that was in keeping with what Nobby himself had done, because he offered me the privilege of receiving communion at his hands, when that would have been anathema to the Pope and to his superiors. But then, when Nobby joined the army, he told his superior after he'd done it. He didn't ask could he join. He joined the army and then told his superior. That's the kind of person he was. And I don't think you'll find anyone of the original 39th Battalion who doesn't see him as some sort of a demigod.
But you've just said that he has a high standing with the 39th. Could you elaborate on that?
I think one of the first things he did goes back to Moresby. And you know, I've never read this anywhere. Vic Austin's book or any of the others. But when we went to Moresby, this is going right back to the beginning, it had the planter mentality, plantation owner mentality. And the natives were slaves. And if a white man was walking down the footpath, the black man had to stand in the gutter. Wasn't allowed to even stand on the same footpath as the white man. And that worried me. But I was enough of an Australian white man to say, well, that's the way it's done. But then Nobby Earl came along and made it very clear to us that these were people with feelings just like us. And he thought it would be a good idea if we made the white planter stand in the gutter and let the black men walk along the street. And to rebel Australian soldiers, that was a hell of a lot of fun. I don't think it endeared us to the local residents, but I think it contributed very much to the relationship that the fuzzy wuzzy angels, as we knew them later, had with us. And I don't think Nobby has ever been given the credit that he should have got for what he did to create a good relationship between the indigenous population and us. And mind you, some of them were very well educated. There was one, and I won't name him, but his name was Michael, and he's known around the world today, not only in New Guinea. I remember sitting down with Michael Samari, Prime Minister, and he had a learned discussion with me about present and past participles. You know, one of these ignorant bungs.
Now, if you had the opportunity to be having this interview in front of a school of 800 kids, what message would you like above all else to tell them?
Well, what about the 39th Battalion, or about the people, or what? Look.
About your experiences in this period.
I don't know. You see, when I'd talk to a mob of kids like that, I would look at them and I'd talk to them, and then I'd decide what I was going to say to them. I never did talk from notes. I'd like to tell you another experience I had with a native boy. This was my own experience. We had a lot of porters under our control because we were the grocers for the army, as it were. And so we had to send the supplies out. And at the forward supply depot, that's about as far forward as supply goes, bullets occasionally whistled through, shells from the mountain gun landed all round us. They never did hit us. But it was about as far forward as supply people ever went. It must have been a lunch break or something, or a smoko break. And I saw this native boy, mind you, he was older than I am, but he was a boy, sitting on a bag of rice. His name was Toro. And I said to him, Toro, you look very thoughtful. What are you thinking about? Just thinking, Taubata. Taubata's their word for master. We weren't their masters, they were ours. They knew so much more than we did. Just thinking, Taubata. What were you thinking about, Toro? About the war, Taubata. What about the war? Stupid. Oh, yes. I think you might be right. Japan boy, he come, he landed Gona. Australia boy, he come, he landed Port Moresby. Australia boy, he walk up into the mountains. Japan boy, he walk up into the mountains. Japan boy, he drive Australia boy back nearly into Port Moresby. Then more Australia boys come and drive Japan boy back into the sea at Gona. Then what do? You sit down and talk. Why don't you talk first?